Lake Baikal, the deepest, oldest, and most mysterious body of fresh water on Earth. It holds 20% of the world's fresh water and secrets that date back millions of years. But in the winter of 1982, during a routine military training exercise, the Soviet Navy found something that wasn't supposed to exist. Not a submarine, not a shipwreck, but life in a form that defied every law of biology. They called them the swimmers, 3-meter-tall giants, dressed in shimmering silver suits, moving through the freezing, dared, crushing depths without oxygen tanks or flippers. This is the story of the encounter that the Kremlin tried to bury under miles of ice. The year was 1982. The Cold War was frozen in a state of high tension. The Soviet Navy was obsessed with underwater supremacy, and Lake Baikal was the perfect, secluded laboratory. Under the cover of scientific hydrology, a group of elite combat divers from the Baikal military district was deployed to the northern shore. Their objective was to test a new generation of deep-sea survival equipment and underwater acoustic sensors. Well, these weren't your average divers. These were the Vityas, men trained to fight and survive in the most hostile environments imaginable. The water temperature was hovering just above freezing. The visibility was hauntingly perfect. Led by Major Nikolai Kirayev, the team prepared for a routine descent to 50 meters, a depth where the pressure begins to squeeze the air out of your lungs, and the silence becomes a physical weight. As the divers descended through the crystal-clear layers, the surface light began to fade into a sickly, deep indigo. Suddenly, Kirayev signaled his team to stop. He pointed into the gloom below. Moving through the water with impossible speed were 3 silhouettes. At first, Kirayev thought they were dolphins, or perhaps a new Western submersible. But as the figures drew closer, the divers realized with a jolt of primal fear that these were men, or things that looked like men. They were massive, standing nearly 3 meters tall. They wore no oxygen tanks, no flippers, and no masks. Instead, their entire bodies were encased in tight, shimmering silver suits that moved like liquid mercury against the current. Their heads were covered by smooth, bulbous helmets with no visible eyes or features. They moved through the crushing pressure as if they were weightless, as if they belonged to the water itself. The divers watched in stunned silence as the giants circled them. There were no bubbles coming from the silver suits, no mechanical hum of an engine, only a low, rhythmic vibration that the divers felt in their teeth. The giants didn't attack. They simply observed. And when Kirayev returned to the surface and reported the encounter, the military command didn't panic. They were intrigued. They saw a technological prize beyond their wildest dreams. The order was issued from the highest levels of the GRU. Capture one of the entities. Use whatever force is necessary. It was a command that would lead Kirayev and his men straight into the jaws of a tragedy that would never be officially acknowledged. The order from the GRU was absolute. Capture one of the swimmers at any cost. Major Kirayev knew the risks, but in the Soviet military, you did not question a direct command from Moscow. The divers descended again, but this time They didn't carry just cameras and sensors. They carried a heavy weighted nylon net, Mike, specifically designed to snare large aquatic life or enemy frogmen. The water of Baikal seemed colder than before, a deep, biting chill that soaked through their thermal suits. As they reached the 50-meter mark, Derrybreak, the indigo void opened up, and there they were. 3 of the silver giants hanging motionless in the water and like statues of liquid mercury. They didn't breathe. They didn't move. They simply waited. Kiriev signaled his men to fan out, to encircle the nearest entity in a classic tactical pincer movement. We wanted the specimen alive. But the specimens had other plans. The divers moved with agonizing slowness, hampered by the crushing pressure of the depths. 2 men held the edges of the net, ready to cast it over the nearest giant. As they drew closer, within 5 meters, Kiriev noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The silver suit of the being wasn't a suit at all. It seemed to ripple and pulse, like a second skin, reflecting the diver's lights in a way that defied the laws of optics. There were no seams, no zippers, no life support tanks, and through the smooth, bulbous helmet, Kiriev felt a gaze, a presence that was ancient, cold, and utterly indifferent to human life. He gave the final signal. The net was cast. For a split second, the nylon mesh draped over the silver giant's head and shoulders. And that was the moment. The abyss fought back. It wasn't a physical strike. It wasn't a weapon they could see. The silver giant didn't even move its arms. Instead, a massive, invisible wave of energy erupted from its body. It hit the divers like a high-velocity train, a pulse of pure, concentrated force that vibrated through their very bones. The water itself seemed to scream, "Hey, do!" In an instant, the tactical formation was shattered. The divers were hit with a kinetic recoil so powerful it sent them into a violent, uncontrolled spin. But the terror was just beginning. The pulse hadn't just pushed them away. None, it had triggered an automatic emergency buoyancy in their suits. Like corks released from the bottom of a bottle, the 7 elite divers were propelled toward the surface. From 50 meters deep, they were shot upward at a speed that the human body cannot survive. As they ascended, the physics of the deep became their executioner. The law of gases is cruel. At 50 meters, the nitrogen in their blood was compressed by the weight of the lake. As they flew toward the surface, that nitrogen began to expand. And then it began to boil. It is called the benz, but this was the benz in its most lethal form. Bubbles of gas formed in their veins, in their joints, and in their brain tissue. On the surface, the support crew on the boat saw a sudden, violent eruption of water, followed by 7 bodies breaking the surface. They weren't floating. They were thrashing. They were screaming a sound that no human should ever make. A sound of blood literally boiling inside a living body. The mission was over. The nightmare had only just begun. The surface of Lake Baikal was no longer a place of peace. It was a scene of industrial-scale agony. 7 elite divers were sprawled across the deck of the support ship, their bodies contorted into shapes that no human frame should hold. This was type 2 decompression sickness, the bends in its most violent form. Inside their bodies, the physics of the abyss were tearing them apart. Nitrogen bubbles, the size of marbles, were migrating through their spinal cords, their joints, and their hearts. They weren't just in pain, they were being dismantled from the inside out. Some were vomiting black bile, others were clawing at their own skin, trying to dig out the invisible fire burning under their flesh. Major Kiriev lay among them, his vision fading, his breath a ragged wet whistle. Mitae knew there was only one way to stop the nitrogen from exploding in their veins. The decompression chamber. The support vessel was equipped with a standard Soviet-issue recompression chamber. But there was a catastrophic problem. The chamber was a type PDC designed to treat 2, perhaps 3 people in an emergency. There were 7 dying men on the deck. The ship's doctor, pale and trembling, looked at the commander. To wait for another ship meant certain death for all of them. To use the small chamber meant a gamble against God. The order was barked out through the freezing wind. Cram them all in. Now. The soldiers on deck began to hoist the paralyzed divers. They were pushed, shoved, and folded into the narrow, cylindrical metal tube. It was a space designed for 2 men to lie down. Now, it held 7. They were packed like cordwood, limbs tangled, faces pressed against the cold, rusted iron walls. The heavy steel door was slammed shut and bolted. The operator began to turn the valves, flooding the chamber with high-pressure air to crush the nitrogen bubbles back into their blood. But the air inside was already foul. 7 men, hyperventilating in terror, were rapidly consuming the limited oxygen. The heat inside the tube began to rise, but a byproduct of the rapid compression. It became a furnace of human misery. And then the screaming started. It wasn't just the pain of the bends. It was the claustrophobia. One diver, his mind snapping under the pressure, began to thrash wildly in the confined space. In the cramped darkness, his flailing limbs struck the others. Panic, infectious and lethal, swept through the chamber. From the outside, the support crew could only listen to the rhythmic, metallic thumping of bodies hitting the walls, and a sound like a chorus of the damned. Then, suddenly, a wet, sickening pop echoed through the metal. The pressure had reached a critical point. One of the diver's lungs, already damaged by the rapid ascent, simply gave way. The screaming stopped, replaced by the sound of gargling and the frantic, desperate scratching of fingernails against the hatch. When the allotted time had passed and the pressure was finally bled off, the doctor opened the door. He immediately turned away and vomited. 3 of the men were dead, their bodies twisted together in a permanent, horrific embrace. The 4 survivors were no longer the elite Vityas of the Soviet Navy. They were broken shells, blind, paralyzed, and whispering about the silver giants that were still waiting for them in the dark. Within an hour, the KGB arrived. The bodies were vanished, and the chamber was welded shut. After the blood was washed from the deck of the support ship, and the survivors were spirited away to nameless military hospitals, a heavy shroud of silence fell over Lake Baikal. The official records of the Trans-Baikal military district were meticulously purged. The mission was classified as a deep water training accident caused by equipment failure. But the KGB didn't just walk away. In the months following the encounter, the Soviet Navy established a permanent, restricted acoustic monitoring station on the northern shore, near the site of the attack. Well, they weren't looking for foreign submarines. They were listening to the abyss. High-sensitivity hydrophones captured sounds that defied explanation. Rhythmic, pulsing clicks that moved at speeds exceeding 200 knots. The swimmers were still there, and they were communicating. Decades passed. The Soviet Union collapsed, but the anomalies of Baikal only grew more frequent. In April 2009, NASA astronauts aboard the International Space Station looked down at the frozen lake and saw something that baffled the scientific community. Two massive, perfect circles were visible in the thick ice, each several miles in diameter. One was located near the center of the lake, the other near the site of the 1982 tragedy. The scientists struggled to explain it, suggesting methane gas bubbles. But the military knew better. Heat signatures from those exact locations suggested a massive artificial source of thermal energy deep below the surface. It was as if something immense, something powerful, was rising from the depths, heating the water until it melted the ice from the inside out before descending back into the dark. Local fishermen today still report seeing shining discs rising from the crystal clear water and disappearing into the Siberian sky in the blink of an eye. They call them the Lords of the Water. They tell stories of strange, silver-skinned humanoids seen standing on the shore in the moonlight, only to walk back into the waves and vanish without a ripple. Is it an extraterrestrial base hidden in the deepest fresh water on Earth? Or is it an ancient terrestrial species that evolved in the isolation of the Baikal Rift millions of years before humanity ever walked upright? Some researchers believe the swimmers are the guardians of a portal, a gateway to a world we are not yet meant to understand. And they have proven with lethal efficiency that they do not wish to be disturbed. The 4 survivors of the 1982 mission spent their remaining years in silence, their bodies broken by the pressure, their minds haunted by the silver reflections in the water. One of them, just before his death in the late 90s, reportedly whispered to his nurse, "We were the intruders. We went into their house, and we brought a net to a god." And today, as you stand on the edge of the Great Lake and look out over the still and blue surface, remember what lies 7,000 feet below. The water is still, the air is cold, and the swimmers are still watching, waiting for the next time we are foolish enough to cast our nets into the dark. Sleep well, if you can,